I don't even see you in my list of attendees now. I don't understand. Oh, there we go. Promote to panelist. There we go. Mariam, there we have you. Okay. Thank you so much. You've tested my technical. I've been found wanting, but there you are. Thank you very much. And thank you. And thank you. Apologies to everybody else who's online waiting for this. We finally got this going. So once again, my name is Peter Larson, and thank you for everybody for being patient as we get this underway. Mariam, you're muted right now, but that's okay. I don't. You can stay. I'm just going to share a little bit of background information before I turn this conversation over to Mariam and to Warren. So let me just share screen here. Share screen from the beginning. So today's session is the challenges of journalism under Israeli military occupation. I'm really happy to have Mariam Barghouti, who is the senior Palestine correspondent for Mondoweiss, based in Ramallah. We'll talk to her a little bit about that. And to help me discuss with her, I have Warren Caragata, who is a former Canadian, a former journalist, and a former Middle East analyst for the Government of Canada. The way this session will unfold today with the welcome, we're a little bit late with the welcoming, I'm afraid. We'll have some background and introductions, and then Warren and I will interview Mariam for about a half an hour about her situation and her challenges, and then we'll open it to questions and answers from the audience. Now, I have enabled the chat function, so anybody on this call can chat with anybody, so you can carry on the chat, but there's also a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and if you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A button. I won't be keeping an eye on the chat because I'll be busy trying to listen to my answers and ask the question. So if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A, and we plan to end up around 2:45. This is one in a series of monthly webinars done by the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine. We didn't, of course, do a couple over the summer, but our next one will be in December, and it's on the question of whether or not it's appropriate to call Israel a colonial enterprise, and does it matter in any event? Increasingly, the term settler colonialism is being used, and we're going to discuss that notion with a Canadian professor who's done some work in that area. Background to our conversation today, of course, the most dramatic thing was the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, a Palestinian American who was killed back in May. Israel has just come out and agreed more or less that they've done it, but they're not going to do any more investigation of her murder. Her death is one of dozens of recorded killings of Palestinian journalists in Israel, going back in Israel-Palestine, going back as far as 2002. There have been, on average, at least one person killed per year since 2002. Most of the people on this call are very familiar with the area, but just in case you're not, I just want to remind you, we're talking about an area that the area that is in purple here on this screen is what Canada recognizes as Israel, is what's recognized as Israel by the United Nations. It has a long border with Egypt. It's at the eastern end, of course, of the Mediterranean, a very long border with Jordan, a border with Syria, and a border with Lebanon. Now, in that purple area there's approximately 9.2 million people living, of whom about 80% are Jews and about 20% are non-Jews. If you look at this whole area that includes the purple area plus this yellow area, Gaza down here, plus the West Bank, which is this area over, and excluding the Golan Heights, which is never part of historic Palestine, the total population is about 13 million, about equally split between Israeli Jews and Palestinians. Not exactly, those are approximate numbers, but it gives you a sense of. And our guest today reports from Ramallah in the middle of the West Bank, and we will find out from her if she's able to also cover events inside Israel, inside Gaza, and so on and so forth. So we can check that with her. Israel, of course, as we know it from the outside, is a booming, high-tech, modern European type country. So it has a lot of similarities. It has also, it has many characteristics of liberal democratic countries. It has, we know that it has regular elections, in fact, very regular elections, universal suffrage, free public education. It claims to have an independent press, and that's something that we can explore a bit with Mariam. We know that there is ongoing press censorship by Israeli security. It claims to have an independent judiciary, and that's something that's also Palestinians would challenge if you're facing the Israeli Supreme Court, which authorizes, for example, expropriation of lands in the West Bank or in Sheikh Jarrah. The military is under civil authority, and there is freedom of speech. But again, that is somewhat limited. Freedom of speech for Israeli citizens is quite broad. For Jewish Israeli citizens is quite broad. Freedom of speech for Palestinian citizens of Israel is rather tightly controlled. The West Bank, of course, as you know, is under military occupation. It has no characteristics of liberal democratic countries. There's no regular elections. The press is very tightly controlled. People live under what's called the civil administration, Israeli military law, and there's little of freedom of speech. And we will explore with Mariam whether that restriction of the freedom of speech comes from the Israeli side or comes from the Palestinian Authority. I'm going to be joined today with interviewing Mariam by Warren Caragata, who was a former Canadian journalist with Maclean's magazine, the Canadian Press. He's lived and worked around the world, and he's also worked for the government of Canada and its international development program as a Middle East analyst for the West Bank and Gaza. He now works as a consulting editor specializing in international development and public policy. Our guest speaker tonight, who we're going to interview, is Mariam Barghouti. So Mariam is the senior correspondent for Mondoweiss. She was born in Atlanta, Georgia. She got a degree from Birzeit University in Palestine and another one from the University of Edinburgh. She's worked as a reporter and researcher for a number of different NGOs, and she's written or had pieces appear in Al Jazeera, the Middle East Eye, BBC, a lot of mainstream publications. She's quite an activist reporter. I have here picked up something from 2014 out of Mondoweiss, where Mariam was actually reporting from being in jail in Israel. So that's a bit of a background, and I'm now want to turn over the questions. Mariam, are you still there? Your video is no longer there.
I am.
Oh, great. Okay. So, Mariam, thank you for that. And feel free to correct any egregious errors in what I had to say, but that's my perception of things. Mariam, I want to start off with a question that a lot of people might find quite interesting. Tell us a bit more about you. You're born in Atlanta, Georgia. You end up now being in Ramallah. How do you get from there to here or here to there? Just tell us a bit about your history, and not only the physical part of it, but your emotional kind of political development as well. That would be helpful background.
Okay. So yeah, I was born in Atlanta, Georgia. I didn't get from there to here. I got from here to there by the forced exile of my parents. My father and my grandfather were in armed resistance, and that was delegitimized then, as it continues to be delegitimized now. So they had to, go in exile, and they're considered returnees. And that is Palestinians with West Bank or Gaza IDs that returned with the Oslo Accords. So we left, I guess, or my parents rather left, like everyone else leaves their home. You leave after you've tried everything you can to survive and live and thrive. And when you can't, and you have children or the prospects of building a family, you try and leave. Atlanta, Georgia exposed a lot to me about American white supremacy and the visibility of racism that was very blatant and obvious in the American South, which, brings into questioning when just now it was mentioned that Israel has the characteristics of a liberal democratic state or countries. And I apologize, but all liberal democratic countries in the world are responsible for some of the most horrendous, disturbing, and violent wars, not just overseas, but domestically. And soft violence is something that is very present in the US. You had an entire American president win elections by rallying racism, not promising to challenge and confront it. And I think that's kind of where my ebb and flow between the US and Palestine is, or I guess the West and the East, although I do think that in of itself is colonial. And I still don't know why we're having questions and debates on whether we should call Israel a colonial regime. It is de facto.
So if I understand correctly, you came back, you were born in Atlanta, your parents were exiles, they returned and you returned at a young age with them, is that correct?
Yeah, so it was always been a back and forth. Part of the Palestinian condition is instability. So they moved back here kind of when I was 3. The second uprising erupts. It was very violent. Again, the Israeli military did strategic escalation dominance, where it continued to provoke Palestinians into confrontation, knowing very well that their military power, their intelligence units, their international impunity means that we don't really stand an honest and fair chance at fighting. So it's basically a slaughterhouse here. So my parents left. They had children that they wanted to, protect and safeguard. And when things kind of settled, right, or there was the event of calm or moment of calm post the second uprising, they returned, and I've been here since. You leave and you come back, and you leave and you come back, but somehow you come back. It's home.
Okay. But you do have American citizenship, is that correct?
Yes, and the American government does not believe in my right to exist. It's actively colluding with Israel. When the piece that you pointed out that I wrote from prison, the American government refused to interfere in my case, despite having been arrested by a military, harassed, assaulted, hit, unjustly imprisoned for a week too long over made up charges. The soldiers started making up the charges as I was standing there. And the American government refused to intervene. So even as a citizen, the US is discriminatory. It's talking about visa waivers for Israelis now, but Palestinians don't even have the right to return to their homes.
Okay, well, you've sort of laid the table out there pretty well. Thank you. Warren, do you want to take what kind of questions have you got?
A couple of, thank you, first of all, for joining and giving us your sense about what it's like to be a journalist in Palestine. First question is, what kind of residency do you have, and does that allow you to travel freely throughout the West Bank? Can you use settler roads? Can you get into Jerusalem? All of those kinds of issues that obviously would make your life either easier or very difficult as a journalist.
So I hold a West Bank ID, and by color categorization, that is the green one. Orange is for Gaza, blue is for Jerusalem, and Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. So in the West Bank, a part of Palestine from the river to the sea that has been, divided, you have settlements that are continuously expanding and annexing privately owned lands as well as publicly owned lands. We could keep problematizing it only when it's privately owned, but they've separated the roads. So there are roads that are de facto restricted to Palestinians, and how they distinguish a Palestinian from an Israeli plated car is color coding. So a yellow plate means Israeli and they can go on these roads. A white or a green plate means West Bank. So no, I can't travel very freely. And if I do want to cover a story or an incident that took place, it'll take me twice as long than it could have had I been just an American journalist here with a press card that is issued by the Israeli government. So it's not just about you. I relatively have more freedom of movement in the West Bank, but that doesn't account for the possibility of being arrested on a checkpoint, for example, or being injured or being targeted by settlers in civilian clothing, right? Because the soldiers are also settlers, they're just institutionalized. But when you say freedom of movement, it's such a layered answer. The answer is no. No Palestinian has freedom of movement. Not a Palestinian with Israeli citizenship, not a Palestinian in Jerusalem, not the West Bank, not Gaza, but they're layered, they're done differently. For me, it's risking detainment. It's risking attack by a settler. But generally, it's not even fair that if I do have freedom of movement in the West Bank, we're in a prison. The entry and exit points to the world are either through a controlled area between Jordan and Israel, or in Gaza between the Egyptians and again, Israel on the other side. So even asking me, do you have freedom of movement in the West Bank, I think is a very unfair question.
So, but for instance, in your job, to get to Jenin from Ramallah, if you can't use the settler roads, it's a 3-hour drive or something, if not longer. That means, I assume as well, you can't get to Hebron. Or very difficult.
I can't, it's difficult, exactly. So we can get to it. And, you know, we're very stubborn as Palestinians, especially I feel like as Palestinian journalists, we're very stubborn. So we'll get there. But it's not just about the time. It's again about the anxieties that we feel throughout that 3-hour, 2.5-hour journey. It's about the fact that, again, we can be arrested. So it's not just the theft of time, it's just the theft of just calm and being and traveling without these considerations.
And you can be arrested for no reason at all, just because you're a Palestinian.
Yes, you will get fabricated charges. That's called administrative detention, where Israel will hold you indefinitely for under no charge or trial with quote unquote secret evidence that is not even shown to you or your lawyer. And your court hearing is held in a closed room with only an Israeli judge and an Israeli prosecutor. So yeah, literally for no reason.
And the fact that you're a journalist, does that put you at greater risk or less risk?
I think in light of the visibility that Palestinians garnered last year, there's an increased attack on not just journalists that are formal. You have civilian journalists, you have activists documenting and filming as well. And that's what journalism is, in essence, a documentation method. But there is an increased attempt at censorship and making sure that the Israeli narrative is what dominates for the international community. The military, the Israeli military has a strategy called impacting international perceptions and attitudes to Israel in a way that only maintains a legitimacy of our use of force. So yeah, there is an increased attack on Palestinians. Just on September 4th of this year, Lama Ghoshe was detained by the Israeli military in Jerusalem in front of her 2 toddler kids. She was released today on house arrest with a 50,000 shekel fine. That's approximately $16,000 American dollars.
Just to follow up on Warren's, what about, for example, something happens in Sheikh Jarrah or Silwan or in the Negev? Can you cover that? I mean, practically, can you cover it? How do you deal with that? I'm sorry, just for people who might not know, Sheikh Jarrah, Silwan are both in East Jerusalem. Officially, they're part of the occupied Palestinian territories, but de facto, they're on the other side of the wall for Mariam, and the Negev even more so. So,
yeah, no, I can't. So technically, I wouldn't be allowed to even enter those areas under Israeli military rule unless I apply for a permit that is issued by the Israeli military coordination office. And the way these permits are given are to ensure that no Palestinian does any confrontation, so it can be used as leverage later on. Like, we'll give you a permit if you're a good girl, Mariam, but you won't be allowed to go cover if we feel like this doesn't do us well. So it's kind of that, it's a very sinister system.
Mariam, this is something I'm still not quite clear on. You have West Bank ID, but you also have an American passport, correct? Now, if I'm in the West Bank, as long as I can get a ride with somebody with yellow plates, I can go over into Israel with no difficulty. I might be stopped. I'll show my passport, and that's it. So why can't you do that? Or why? Because you refuse to, or you can't do it, or what's the practical impediment?
So I can do it. Israel's inherently racist. I don't look like a typical Palestinian. I look like, you know, an American, essentially, or whatever racially ambiguous stereotype they want to build in their imagination. But that would be the only way that I would get in. I can do that. That's essentially how you get in as well, Peter, right? It's racial profiling. Yeah. And legally, yeah, no, I can't do that. Technically, by the way that I look, yes, I can. So it comes again to this blurred lines that Israel has. It's not just this way or that way. It's very intricate and inherently racist.
But your American passport is stamped, so they can tell from the stamp in your, no?
So yes, Israel technically stamps every dual citizen's passports with their ID, so they can tell, oh, even if you do have dual citizenship, you're still a Palestinian. That means it's okay to shoot you, it's okay to arrest you, it's okay to harass you. But I personally refuse having my passport stamped, so I actually don't allow it. I ask for it to be on another paper, and that's everyone's right, especially those that want to travel to other areas like Lebanon or elsewhere that Israel deems an enemy state.
So for instance, have you been to Gaza? Is it possible? Have you kind of managed to get there? And that's a whole other story.
So yeah, I went to Gaza in 2019. And the only reason I was able to go is because I was applying with an international organization as part of a research assignment, measuring poverty in Gaza. So the only reason I was allowed to go is, again, because I was affiliated with an international organization, not as a Palestinian. And the entire trip through Erez, which is kind of up to the north of historic Palestine, you walk into the checkpoint and you have, you know, these glass windows that are on top. So they're watching us from above. And then sometimes they will ask you to take off your clothes if they want to. Again, depending on who you are, if you're an international or you're a Palestinian with an international, like the extent of how far they go varies depending on your identity. And they look through your things, and you're not allowed to take in objects or certain products into Gaza, but worse is you're not even allowed to take anything out. Like if you have a bag with wheels, they'll turn you back. And you need to keep in mind that most people that pass through this checkpoint are labor workers. They're Palestinian labor workers that are constantly humiliated, that are constantly attacked and vilified and criminalized, and treated as though this is a merciful grace from Israel, that they're letting them go and work as labor workers. So for me to go in there, that was a privilege. And it's a really sad story that I consider that a privilege.
And were you allowed to do any reporting there, given your relationship with the international organization, or you were tied up principally with the work that you were doing with this international organization?
No, of course. I mean, the research is out. So my reporting then was part of a research assignment. I do consulting, as well as monitoring and evaluation for organizations of humanitarian aid previously. So yeah, no, I stuck to my own assignment, but that doesn't take away from listening to stories, from documenting the stories and hearing people and joining them in conversations. And I did exactly that. And I continuously go back to those testimonies and I incorporate them in current stories as well. Whether or not describing Israeli policies is one thing, and then describing how I'm reacting to it is another. So just because Israel says no doesn't mean that that's how we will treat it as Palestinians. And that's how the resistance right now continues to rise as well. I'm not sure if you're getting what I'm saying, Warren, but I'm trying to also shift away the focus from me as a journalist and as a Palestinian from just the violations that happen against me, and to also reclaim me as Mariam.
I'm just going to, as moderator, I'm just going to intervene here, reminding people, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. I will be looking at them. I would suggest you have questions pertaining to the topic today on the challenges of reporting under occupation, rather than wandering off into general issues of policy and so on. If you have comments you want to make, put them in the chat. Don't put them in the Q&A, because we reserve the Q&A for legitimate questions we can put to Mariam, if you don't mind. Mariam, I want to, given the fact that Shireen was killed a few months ago, that there was another young Palestinian lad, I think, who was killed in Jenin a week or so ago, as he was filming using TikTok. He was filming an Israeli military incursion. How much actual physical danger are you in? Is it all the time completely at random, or you kind of know when you're entering into a danger zone? How do you personally manage danger?
I think I do it very badly. um, so there is danger when you're on the field. Of course, there's danger. There's danger against anyone and everyone, especially now. They just got full immunity from any accountability after the Shiri and Abu Akleh case. And they're going to go with that full force. Israel has been warning about increased military operations next year for a few months now. But the danger isn't just on the field. I remember last year I was terrified to stay at home alone from, you know, the possibility of just having my apartment raided and being arrested, not just by Israel, but also by the Palestinian Authority. And we keep, you know, forgetting the role of the Palestinian Authority in this constantly, which is a proxy army for Israel. But I don't manage it. I live, you know, in constant anxiety and constant fears. I constantly have to sit and think once, twice, 3 times about the language that I use by, you know, trying to stay as safe as possible, but at the same time doing justice to the people whose story I'm relaying. I do everything I can. I wear my press vest. I wear my helmet. I take my heat training. I know how to deal with, you know, different weapons being fired at me.
Your what training?
Heat. So it's an emergency kind of an aid care as a journalist in conflict areas, except I don't like the word conflict. So.
But when you say heat, you're referring to climate, you're referring to actual temperature. Is that what you mean? Or do you mean military heat?
No, this is like a certified training that's usually provided to journalists and international aid workers in areas of conflict, just to be able to give yourself first aid in case you're shot or attacked or, you know, bombed. But yeah, none of it matters. It doesn't keep you safe. And for me, I remember when I was taking the training, for example, there isn't that recognition that when you're on the field and you get injured, even if I do manage to get into my first aid bag, take out my chest bandage and put it, for example, on my chest where there's a bullet wound. Israel constantly stops ambulances from reaching the injured. They actively impede our access to care. So, you know, managing is just having heart, and it's enduring, but also enduring in knowing that this is going to end sooner rather than later, right? And this is kind of where the role of Canada also comes in. I'm speaking with, you know, an audience that is in Canada, and it's speaking about those policies and how that impacts us. It's not how I manage to stay safe. That shouldn't be the question. The question should be, how are we contributing to your lack of protection? And I think that's maybe, you know, when we can see change. I'm not here to share my personal story. And I don't think any Palestinian should be asked on anywhere to share their personal story. I'm here to share how we can change this story to something different. So let's talk about Canada. Let's talk about the latest import and export deals between them and Israel. Let's talk about how Israel has, the Mossad assassinated people in international waters using the Canadian ID. And yet Canada only withdrew their ambassador for a week. So these are the questions that I think should be coming out instead of just asking me to relay kind of that narrative, although I do understand the power of testimony.
But if I can just, sorry to go back though, because some people may not understand some of the issues in terms of the way the West Bank is divided up. Do you live in Ramallah, for instance, in Ramallah proper, or you don't have to you don't live in one of the, because I know some people who live in a village outside Ramallah, but they have to go into Ramallah every day for work, which means they have to go through the checkpoints, and that takes a long time, and sometimes they're closed and etc. So can you talk just a little bit about, not just for you, but the difficulty that people have, even because I think a lot of people think of the West Bank and, oh, you look at all that territory that the Palestinians have, they can go everywhere. Can you talk a little bit just about how kind of bifurcated it is between the areas that are under more or less Palestinian control and then the other areas that are under Israeli control, and how difficult it is for Palestinians to move around?
So the entire historic Palestine is under Israeli control. There is no area that's under Palestinian control, right? That's like theory, that is ink on paper. In reality, the entire palace, like the whole, from the river to the sea, from Safa to Bi'r Saba, the Negev, okay? That is all under Israeli control, and we're constantly being driven out in different ways, whether it's making us reach a point where we think life here is impossible, whether it's physically, people like Yaakov and Sheikh Jarrah telling Muna al-Kurd, if I don't take your house, someone else will. If it's not that, it's the carpet bombing of Gaza. If it's not that, it's the home demolitions for Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. So it's all under Israeli control. In terms of movement, each person, depending on where they fall in the Israeli classification system, is allowed to travel differently. So there are, for example, checkpoints that all Palestinians can pass through, like Qalandia, that is notorious for the way it humiliates Palestinians. While other checkpoints, like Hizma, is only reserved, and these are both for the Jerusalem area. Hizma is reserved only for those with Israeli ID, right? So what exactly are you asking me when you say the like bifurcation of it? Which aspect of that experience?
The fact that, I mean, areas under the kind of the area A that's under a kind of PA control, those are very small parts of the West Bank, and to move from place to place is very difficult. That's basically the point. So if you live in a village outside Ramallah, to get into Ramallah, it can take you a long time because you need to go through checkpoints, right?
Yes, but also checkpoints aren't just the concrete structure that falls. If the Israeli army raids in the morning, yeah, I'm not going to be able to travel because they're going to shoot at me. There is no area that's under the Palestinian Authority's control. Even the Muqata, the headquarters of the president, was held under siege with when Yasser Arafat was there. This is the signatory and like one of the architects of the Oslo Accords. His headquarters was besieged by the Israeli military. So there is no area that is under the Palestinian Authority's control, but there are areas where the Palestinian Authority's police does the dirty work instead of the Israeli army. And I think that's a very important distinction.
Mariam,
Peter looks like he wants.
go ahead. Go ahead, Warren.
So one of the questions that we talked about when we were is how you, as a former journalist, how you balance being very much kind of a Palestinian in Palestine against kind of not the objectivity, because that doesn't exist, but at least the kind of the fairness that journalists kind of have to approach their work, and what are the complications for you when you're trying to do your work both as a journalist and somebody who believes so strongly in the cause that you're part of?
I do my work with the same objectivity that any American journalist does covering domestic issues. And I think I do the same judgment that any American journalist does in covering white supremacy in the US or racism towards the Black community in the US. There is a constant questioning of Palestinian journalists, although historically it's always the local journalists that kind of understand the nuance. Now, the questioning of how I manage it comes from the assumption that Israel maybe is not a colonial state. It is. It absolutely is. And the way I uphold my journalistic integrity is by showing that even when I'm criminalized, even when I'm vilified, even when I and most journalists here are de facto risking their lives, most who lost it, like Shireen Abu Akleh. So it's, for me, it's not managing how I approach my reporting or my story. It's managing the discomfort of those reading the stories and being exposed to it. But I think I manage it just fine, other than having to constantly answer to the different labels of differentiation, like, oh, you know, how do you manage being an activist and a journalist? Every person with a passion to their profession, be it scientist, be it professor, be it analyst, be it advisor, does not differentiate between things like activists. That means you're an active mobilizer in your community. You're trying to achieve change. or you're trying to make something better. We don't just do things by virtue of just doing them. That's our involuntary action of our body. That's things like breathing, etc. But engaging with a social community is, I think, slightly different. I'm not sure if that answers or makes sense, but I hope it does.
Maybe, Mariam, a sort of more technical question that come in from the audience. Brian asks, how does the IDF distinguish between a journalist and a tourist with a camera, or for that matter, a Palestinian with a camera?
It doesn't really. Generally, we have press cards, right? That's how you distinguish, but that's only if the soldier got that close to you. Most of the times they prefer to shoot from afar. In most cases, it's in someone's back, if you want to look at the statistics. But they don't distinguish. And one of the statements that was said when Shireen was killed was her camera is a weapon. So for Israel, the gun is also the camera. So it's not just about being shot at, it's also shooting a scene of them shooting at Palestinians that they don't want either. So they don't distinguish. They've killed internationals as well. Rachel Corrie in Gaza, who did a lot of documentation and active attempts to stop the demolitions and colonization of Palestinians. Tom Hurdle was also killed. He's an American with a camera. And to suggest that Israel would even consider distinguishing is to suggest that Israel has a consciousness or an inkling of humanity, which we have seen on and off again. It does not. And it's really difficult for people to have that resonate, but it does not.
I see another question here from Bernard. Noticing that in your resume, you've written for a number of mainstream media. I can't remember the list, New York Times and CNN or whatever. Do you still do that? And if so, or do you try to do it? And do you have challenges getting your work placed there? What's your experience there?
So, I mean, I feel like if any challenges, it was before. A lot of my commissioning editors would struggle with their editorial boards over language I would use, from occupation to a colonial state. And, you know, after every piece in bigger magazines and bigger newspapers or news networks, I know the producers might, you know, face backlash internally. Deutsche Welle, for example, in Germany, banned their reporters from saying apartheid. And yet we question Palestinians about being objective. The same thing you've seen at the BBC, the same thing you've seen at CNN and at the New York Times. So now I don't try because I have Mondoweiss. So I place all my reporting there. I place all my analysis pieces and opinion pieces as well on there. But I don't struggle as much. And I also think more people of color are joining editorial and senior positions. And that naturally will shift dynamics. We tend to, you know, uplift more, give more visibility. We dare say the words because we can't afford otherwise. We're the ones receiving the consequences, right? So there is that. But the bigger mainstream news networks, they're receiving so much pressure from lobbying pro-Israeli ideological groups. And these are also terrorist settler groups that are based in the US that are doing these lobbying. And it's up for us to empower and uplift them. You know, you had Wild get fired from the Washington Post for calling out Israel as an apartheid state. That doesn't come from a vacuum. That's an entire group lobbying for it.
Warren?
The how do you cover Palestinian events, not the conflict with Israel? So you talk about the PA. How do you cover the PA? How do you cover Hamas? And in your role as an activist, I can imagine, kind of from my past, that if you're critical of one of those Palestinian organizations, other Palestinians can say, but you're hurting the movement because you're giving a bad image of Palestinians to the rest of the world or to other Palestinians. So how do you deal with that, and how do you decide, well, I'm just going to kind of tell the truth about PA corruption or Hamas treatment of women or et cetera. So how do you deal with those kinds of issues?
The same way I cover exactly Israeli colonialism. Like I said, the Palestinian Authority is a proxy of Israel. And as long as Israel continues to get impunity, so will the Palestinian Authority by association. On June 24th of last year, Nizar Banat was assassinated by the Palestinian Authority. And this is a political critic, but also he was a candidate for the Palestinian Legislative Council. Up until now, there was no accountability. The 14 men, the security forces that were recorded on camera, CCTV, entering his home, beating him to death in front of his wife and children, were set free by our president, who is almost 14 years past his expiration term. So yeah, I cover it the same way I cover any story. And that is by being honest and by being sincere. But that is also by contextualizing, by being smart enough to research and to not take things at face value, by asking 1 or 2 or 3 sources. And I think this is part of what journalism is. It's doing the hard work. It's not taking talking points from a speech that was probably ghostwritten for a president or a representative. It's looking at the impact.
Does following on that, does the PA actually care about what you write? You write in Mondoweiss. I don't even know whether they would be aware of it.
They're aware. I have to register for my press card.
Okay. And do they
Yeah.
ever threaten, frown, discourage? How they can't be the kind of fearless reporting that you're talking about there is not something that they must be happy about. So what's the deal?
Right. So, I mean, that I think also comes associated with different layers. It comes associated with the fact that I write in English, so I have a very international audience. The fact that the Palestinian Authority still has some inkling of hope to create an alliance with the US, and I am an American citizen. So these different layers contribute, for example, to protecting me against being threatened, right? But in the end, I also know that the Palestinian Authority collaborates with Israel. And if they really don't like me and don't want to get the blame, they can have the Israeli military throw me in jail and put me in administrative detention. And yes, I have received threats. I've received threats from the Palestinian Authority. At 18, the Israeli Shabak took me into interrogation, attempted to recruit me like they do with most Palestinian youth. And that is always for people that speak out. That is for people that say what is happening. You get attacked from all sides. And it was really interesting that you mentioned Hamas's attitude towards women. Hamas is also responsible for assassinating people like Vittorio Arrigoni. You could have mentioned that as well. And you need to remember that Hamas
that was
is
an Italian journalist who was in
group.
Gaza about 10 years ago, something like that. Is that the person we're talking about?
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. No, not at all. I'm sorry. But yeah, Vittorio is. He was an Italian activist as well as reporter that was killed 10 years ago in Gaza by Hamas for his coverage. And they have committed a lot of crimes, right? Like the Palestinian Authority, like Israel, that Palestinians have consistently talked about. But we mention these crimes in a context that tries to take away from what's really happening. Hamas is a militant group that is constantly also placed in a pressure cooker, whether in its competition with the Palestinian Authority or with its attempt to also remove the siege on Gaza. That is constantly being pressured into doing what anyone would do, which is surviving, which is also protecting, which is fighting back and confronting. So Israel can go and carpet bomb Gaza. So I just didn't appreciate that framing, Warren, in terms of when you were asking about something very real, and that's being threatened from authorities with power relations and dynamics above me for my work.
I'm not sure how, help me, I didn't understand what Warren said. Reframe the argument again, because I'm confused here.
Right. I was saying, Warren, given your experience, I don't think it was fair or just when you were asking about the threats I would receive as a journalist from the Palestinian Authority. And then to ask on, reporting on Hamas and, for example, its treatment of women. I think that was underpinned by ideologies and stereotypes that were pushed forward by colonial narratives. And I think it's underpinned also by Islamophobic sentiment. But at the same time, the actual question was, do you receive threats from these, authorities that are meant to be technically Palestinian or part of my population? So it's really about kind of the framing, and that's what I'm trying to also get across as a reporter. Our ability to contextualize events and dynamics is what really shows what's happening, right? Our line of inquiry.
No, I'm sorry though. Maybe you misunderstood the question, but what I was really, I know from my past experience as both an activist and a journalist, that when you report critically on organizations that are close to you, people who are part of that will say, yeah, but you're supposed to be on our side. And so to criticize, I know a lot of people who are who would say, yeah, the PA may be corrupt, but they don't want, they work for it, or they are supported by it, or etc. So it's really that question about how you kind of then manage to kind of say, yes, I'm going to report all of the faults that I see, regardless of whether or not that you may think that damages the Palestinian, the overall Palestinian cause.
So, yeah, I mean, it's scary. It's very, very scary, especially with, living in a place where it's very small. So you're constantly a target, and there's nowhere to really find refuge. But at the same time, we report not just on the flaws, right? We also report on the good. We report on what's fair. We report on what's really happening. It's not just an attempt to report to say, it's not saying, for example, the PA is corrupt for the sake of saying the PA is corrupt. In the same breath, we say that the Palestinian Authority also was the only party that agreed to the entire agreement of the Oslo Accords when Israel violated basically every statement it had signed on, right? But at the same time, does that alleviate the PA from its oppressive, authoritarian approach towards Palestinians? Absolutely not.
You've talked a couple of times about
If anything, it reinforces it.
The PA isn't the only Palestinian political force at work in the West Bank. Hamas also has a very considerable presence, as do some others. Do you get pushback from that as well, or they don't have the military or the police capability that the PA does? At least
No,
in the
I
West
mean,
Bank.
they do. I wouldn't belittle Hamas, just because it's like more closer to guerrilla militant instead of an Israeli army. I wouldn't take away from that. But at the same time, they're very irrelevant. The Palestinian Authority is irrelevant. Hamas is irrelevant. Across the past few years, Palestinians, the next generation, is really not going to know these names except by historical narrative. But they're carving out a new Palestinian identity that is not based on factions that were created in confrontation to Israel. They're trying to carve an identity that is very much their own, that is very much not defined by their oppressor, but by themselves. So the risks that we do take now is also because we know they're not going to really exist, at least in the far future. So that's how, again, we stay honest to the story as well. It's recognizing the only constant is change.
What about other reporters? I'm a little bit familiar. Many people on this call will be a little bit familiar with Amira Haas, who reports for Haaretz. I didn't know anything about Shireen before she was murdered. She was mostly visible in Arab media, I take it. Are there other people or groups that that we should know about? What voices should we be paying attention to, Mariam, in addition to yours, of course?
There are many voices, actually. You have Dr. Yara Hawari, you have Jalal Abu Khatir, you have Zaina Tahan. Middle East Eye is an excellent source. Al Jazeera English is an excellent source on Palestine. For me, if you want to know about developments, I would follow different news networks And you know, there is English speaking Palestinian reporters. We don't have to get our news just from Amira Haas, no matter how progressive and, you know, radical she's considered in Israeli media. We are reporting our stories as well. She helps amplify, I guess, there. But I would also recommend the Institute for Palestine Studies to just kind of go on their website and look at the different historical narratives, the play-by-play that they post every single day on what happened. And I trust people's intelligence as well. I mean, if you, you know, you see the facts as they are, raw and bare, you'll be able to at least understand that this isn't a conflict.
I can, in a follow-up email, I'll send an email to everybody who's on this call, and I can, I think I know, afterwards you can send me a couple of the links, Mariam, and I can make sure I get it right, and I can include that in the email to people so
Absolutely.
they'll know what else to do. Warren?
There's a question from one of the people on the session, and that is whether or not there's any formal PA censorship, or whether or not that exists in a more kind of informal, backhanded way.
I appreciate that question. So yeah, there's complete Palestinian Authority censorship. They've removed websites, like approximately 60 websites in 1 year at some point. By presidential decree, they released a cybercrimes law in 2017. And that, like, it's similar to one of the legislations that Israel uses to target and arrest Palestinians. That is, if you have anything on your social media posts, you will be summoned for interrogation, whether you'll be out or not. We don't know. For example, right now, even if you're a journalist writing on your personal page, we have Mohammed Atiq, who's being held in the Jericho prison. It's notorious for the torture chambers by the Palestinian Authority. And then you have, on the other hand, the Israeli military censor, and that is a censor that bans even Israeli journalists from discussing things related to military operations. So there's like embargoes on what kind of weapons are being used against us that we can't really share. So we rely on international journalists and news networks to cover these stories. So there's heavy censorship, but there's also a lot of really good journalists moving around it.
We have about five or 10 minutes left here, so I encourage people to put questions in the Q&A, particularly questions relating to the topic, namely the challenges of reporting under Israeli military occupation. I know that Mariam has views on all kinds of political issues, but I'd like to focus as much as we can on those particular issues, which is the challenge of the day. What do you, Mariam, how do you handle your relationship with Mondoweiss? You do an article every week. Do you have like a regular schedule? How does that work?
So I think like most journalists here, you're on the desk around the clock. There's always something happening. And, you know, I have a beautiful, beautiful team. Tariq Hajjaj, Yumna Patel, Adam Horowitz, of course, and Philip Wise, and Michael Arya, and Faris Jaqaman. And I think we all try and tag team as much as we can in terms of discussing different developments. And we're very niche, we're very focused. So we discuss US policy, Palestine, and Israel. So we are able to at least, you know, focus our energies on the different links. And I think that's how we manage it. We see what's happening, where it falls in the larger coverage we've had, what we've seen developing, and we kind of try to build, you know, the stories. We gather as many testimonies as we can, we verify information, and then we see what is being told across the different arenas and, you know, what's the thread.
I think anybody on this call who isn't already subscribed to Mondoweiss should at the very least take a look at it and see what you think. I referred to all those people that Mariam referred to. We are making a small contribution to Mondoweiss in return for this collaboration with Mariam today. And we've also said that if we get any donations after this webinar, we're happy to share them with Mondoweiss, which we think is doing a terrific job. Mariam, Annie asks whether there's an informal warning system amongst Palestinians in neighborhoods or villages that alerts them to the increased presence of PA police or army and so on, so they know whether it's safe to go to shops or go to work or to school. How does that work, please?
You hear a lot of kids shouting. But yeah, I laugh, but that's also truth. They're very, like, towns here are relatively small. So, by ways of WhatsApp groups, you yell and you inform, but also you see, it's very visible. Palestine is really not that big. And in terms of vantage point, you get clear vantage point of when the PA is raiding, when the Israeli military is raiding. And both of them make it very clear that they're there, because more than anything, it's a show of dominance, not just, a targeted assassination, but it's a terrorizing of the entire community. And that's how you keep communities silent. That's how you keep them ignorant. That's how you keep them from demanding their rights. So we inform each other by first sees, sends the first text kind of thing. But yeah.
I've been told that as far as the major cities like Ramallah go, that during the day, it's normally the Palestinian Authority that exercises policing, but that at night, they basically keep out of the way of the Israeli military that comes in at will. Is that your experience?
So Israeli military raids tend to happen mostly in the evening, right? 11 p.m. up until dawn hours. And they have a coordination agreement with the Palestinian Authority security forces. So when the Israeli military wants to come into Area A, the PA or its armed forces technically are supposed to evacuate the area, because the West Bank has been demilitarized as part of Oslo. So the only people visibly with weapons are the security forces. So to avoid, I guess, armed confrontation, Israel has coordinated or made it law that the Palestinian Authority forces leave. So they call them ahead of time. This is COGAT, the coordination office for the military. And they tell them to leave. So it's not really that it's a managing it at night and the other in the day. It's dependent on who they're trying to arrest that evening and which area.
Warren?
Forgive the question, but when you're covering this day by day, I know you've decided to stay, but are there times when the optimistic side of you becomes kind of overwhelmed by what you're seeing? And do you wonder whether or not this is ever going to end? I mean, I think you said earlier that but there is an optimism that things are in the process of moving. So that kind of gives you fortitude. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, also just, sitting here with you and Peter, it's again, it reignites another spark of faith in, I guess, the entire world, but more than that, in our daring to imagine other than, to kind of let go of everything inherited and imagine other than. Yeah, I do have hope for the future. I certainly have hope for the future. I think in the distant future, we're not going to be living in a state system generally. I think that's going to fall like the empire system fell. And I have more and more belief in the younger generation. And there's a visible, living essence where I want to live as I am. And that is as it is, you deal with your discomfort. So we can kind of grow into ourselves a lot more. And I think Israel will fall, not just because of Palestinian resistance, because the international community will eventually realize it. That is how every criminal regime fell. It eventually falls. It's unsustainable. It is unsustainable to be that sinister, that vengeful, death to Arabs. Your population is chasing Palestinians with butcher knives in the streets, chanting death to Arabs. That is what we saw last year. We saw Palestinians sleeping in the same apartment because settlers were marking homes to be assaulted later. And yet we survived, and we're here. And many more people expressed their solidarity. Many more people started boycotting Israel. Many more representatives started calling out Israel. Although I don't think it's enough to call out, I do think it shows the trajectory of where we're headed. just the fact that Israel is also trying to control its representation in the international community after its exposure is very telling that it's falling. It's obsessed with nuclear weapons. Israel is obsessed with nuclear weapons. No state survives like that.
Mariam, this maybe
Do you feel any optimism when you look across on the other side of the wall among young Israelis and the way that they may be looking at a one-state solution? Does that give you any sense that maybe there is some hope?
Absolutely. When Palestine is liberated, you can have a Palestinian citizenship regardless of your religion. And I don't see why that's problematic, But yeah, if you want the one state, two state, before any state solution, we need to make sure refugees return, that Palestinians are compensated, they have access to their villages, towns, and natural resources. And then, of course, I think we can start discussing everything else. But I do feel like we'll be a welcoming state, not a hostile one, but not state, because I feel states are going to fall. But yeah, I think we'll be a welcoming community.
Well, at your age, Mariam, you can afford to take a long view of history. I have to have more short term. Listen, this has been terrific. We're getting towards the end here. First of all, my hat's off to you for your articulation of your issues, your description, your courage under fire, and your optimism, which is encouraging. I want to thank Warren very much for, as an experienced journalist, coming in and probing you with questions.
I appreciate you both. Thank you for being patient with me as well. My explaining over. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Mariam, we will, as I said to everybody, I will send a follow-up email with the recording for everybody who's interested. You can share it with your friends if they're interested, and also include some links to both to Mariam's work at Mondoweiss and also some other suggestions of other people or sources anyone might want to look at on this. I remind people that our next webinar will be on whether or not it's legitimate to call Israel a settler colonial state. I know that Mariam thinks that issue is resolved, but I think for a lot of Canadians it isn't yet, and so we're going to discuss it. So please permit us to discuss it, even if you're very clear on that.
Please do. But that also needs to include how Canada is colonial also, or its colonial dynamics that are still present. We can't discuss Palestine if you can't discuss, your own self.
Thank you very much. And I don't disagree, but it's a little bit off our patch, but I don't disagree. Truth and reconciliation is a question that's very hot here. And you may or may not have noticed, Mariam, at the beginning, at the beginning of the slideshow, I did give a shout out to the fact that this takes place on unceded Anishinaabe territory. So once again, thank you to everybody for attending. Thank you, Warren, for helping me. And Mariam, thank you so much for being so generous with your time.
Thank you all, for the space. And
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Take care.